Bennett, just go ahead and take it away, buddy.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So, hello everybody, and welcome back from the Thanksgiving break and the break of a couple of weeks, in fact, because I was off a couple of weeks ago. So, there's a few things I want to cover today, and feel free to take this in different directions. But what I want to try and do is, we've got our December draft coming up. We want to have a fairly minimal but fairly tidy set of business entities and terms about those entities to present to the object management group at our December meeting in a couple of weeks' time. And there's a lot of other things which we'll then come back to between then and the formal release in February, when we can pick up and clean up any remaining terms that we need to deal with. So over the last few weeks, we've done a couple of things. We've looked at the basic types of entity that we're interested in, and we've dealt with the LEI concept of what's called legal entity in the LEI universe and how that relates to formal organizations and legally liable entities and so on. And we then did a deep dive into fund-related terms and special purpose vehicles and so on. I should admit that I'm still working through some of the very detailed comments and pointers and so on the trust and fund related work. So I've done some of the changes on that, but that's something I'd like to come back to at a later time. I think to get a good sensible state of the model for the December draft, there's two things I particularly want to do this week, and then hopefully we should be able to think about putting that to bed. One is, you may have noticed in the notes from the previous session and some of the follow-up conversations I had with people in Dublin and so on, some new proposals or confirmations on some of the naming of some of the entities that we talked about. So I want to dive into that first. And then we've got a bunch of common facts about formal organizations, about corporate entities and so on. There's actually not very much to it. There's things like different types of name, trading names, brand names, registered names and so on, and various address concepts. And we've been doing a lot of work with the proof of concept team on better ways of handling the addresses of things. That was originally a temporary holding pattern that we had, and we've done some work on that, which I'll show you, and just see what else we need that is common facts about entities that need to be in this first December draft, because I'd like to get that stuff cleaned up this time round. Something else we should maybe just think about on paper at this point is which of the different kinds of relationships between entities we want to see in the final model. In this draft, I think we have the most important types of relationships, which is those that relate to the ownership of voting shares. So in other words, a control ownership relation between companies. But clearly there are control ownership where the owner isn't a company or is another kind of entity. There's ownership without control. There's control without ownership. There's other kinds of relationships. So if we get time today, I think we should just sketch out on paper here what are the relationships we want to be able to see, and then some of those are already in the model, some of them are a bit unfinished, some of them are already fairly complete in the model. We can work out what we want to include and have a look at those next week. If we get time, I've only done a few changes on the trust side of things. It's not all going to go into the December draft. I think we need to take our time and get that one right. So just figure out what to put in the December draft and what to come back to, similarly with special purpose vehicles and special purpose entities and so on. So that's the kind of broad agenda for what I want to cover today.
Mike, does our relationship types include roles played in a process?
Oh, it can, and we have quite a few of those. It's quite a complex part of the model, and we haven't shown it. So things like clearing and settlement entities, reporting entities, that kind of thing.
Well,
Yes,
guarantor, obligor, counterparty, all those things.
yes, indeed it does. And we have, well, most of those kinds of role are defined in the instrument models where they apply. So in the debt models, we have guarantors and so on. But I think this is a very hot topic in the LEI conversations and so on, which is, should these kinds of relationships also be included in the legal entities model? I'm inclined to think they should, and that's something I'd like us to discuss.
Well, if we're going to make this thing operational and use it for reporting and use it for hierarchical analysis and relationship structures, then we need to have this in the model.
Right, thank you.
Post haste, please.
Right, well, I can show you what we do have for many of these, and I think if we agree what should be in the model, then perhaps next week's session we should dive in and look at those. But if people want to look at them this week, I'm happy to do that as well.
It's nice to know that my voice is consensus, but just one opinion.
Does anybody disagree with Mike? Put your hand up now. Sorry about the cough. Yes, that's so. Yeah, when we originally the previous draft of this, there were a number of things that we decided were needed more work and were out of scope for now. And part of that was reporting entities. And I had an interesting conversation at the FSA over here in the UK last week, where they came up with something quite interesting, which actually affects our common facts as well, our names and so on, which is that for some reporting, some large group, Barclays, whatever, might elect to, and correct me if I'm getting this slightly wrong, but might elect to report around a brand name. They might have different kinds of organizational subunits and different registered legal persons and so on, different corporate entities, all grouped under a common brand name, and would elect to report on the basis of that. And I've actually implemented that change in the reporting entity part of the model, and it might be that we're getting close to being ready to include that, perhaps even in the first draft, but certainly in the formal thing.
Wouldn't the regulators determine how they want them to report? Because reporting by brand name seems kind of ridiculous.
It surprised me, and I'm cautious that I've probably misrepresented what they said. But brand name, yeah, I don't know under what legislation people have the choice to choose what they report by, but find that
if time permits in your process, Mike, I'd love to have a conversation about what people are using for their own risk analysis, some scenarios, percent ownership, role played, what matters to the financial institutions, what matters to the vendors, and ultimately what matters to the regulatory analysts.
Yes, let's just capture that. What matters to people?
In terms of risk analysis and reporting.
Yeah. Anything else that we should include in that?
Yeah. So the big conversation I'm having is, who cares about names like subsidiary, joint venture, part owner? Do we care about percentage of ownership, and how are we going to actually report that stuff to the regulators?
Yeah, and it might be that just looking at the different regulations that are in play would give a pointer as to what are the kinds of things. So if we look at
regulators are trying to figure this out too, so we're going to try to cooperate with regulators and help them understand what the industry does so they can make decisions.
Fantastic. So the reporting model is quite complex, and we haven't really looked at it before, but I'll just give you a quick run through it, because it might give us an idea of what's there and what's missing. So we have the concept of obligations and rights, and one kind of obligation is a statutory obligation. That's one that's mandated by some statute. Another is the reporting obligation. Now, I guess there may be, here they are. statutory reporting obligations, which are both non-statutory reporting obligations. I guess that would be like a reporting obligation to an exchange or something. So for each of these obligations, who has the obligation or what has the obligation and what is it to? So you have your statutory authorities, your regulatory entities, your statutory regulators, which are both. And what are the entities? Well, you have legal person, you have formal organization, body corporate or artificial legal person. Now somewhere here, oh yes, where is it? Nope, can't find it. So you have, going back to this question about process-related entities that you mentioned just now, so we have this whole taxonomy of kinds of what we call relative business entities. This is any entity that is defined in a role rather than in and of itself. And those include process role entities, and there's reporting requirements around that. So those are always defined in the context of some business context, such as some financial industry process like clearing and settlement, so settlement entity and so on. Is there reporting for those? I'm not sure. There's reporting entity. We need to define what are the different reporting processes. There's probably a whole set of those for each set of reporting regulations. That's why this isn't very complete. Statutory. So this is what is the entity that's reporting. But now here's the interesting thing. One kind of relative entity as well is a business, because a business may be, you know, a sole trader, a partnership, a limited company, whatever. It's defined in terms of the fact that it exists to make profit rather than defined in terms of its actual properties and its nature. But one thing it has, of course, in relation to it being a business is its brand name. And so there's the, oh, here it is. Yes, I have this kind of logical combination. This is a logical union. It doesn't look like one, but it separates out what is the reporting about versus what's doing the reporting. So if we follow this little line backwards, is about, right, the reporting obligation, some entity has the obligation. The reporting, what it's obliged to report about, could be any of this logical any of combination. It could be reporting about some body corporate, which would be itself, could be reporting about some organizational subunit, such as a branch or a division, or this is a new one, if this FSA thing hasn't been fully misunderstood by me, could be reporting about some business, and some business is defined by being something with some commercial identity or brand name, but being a relative entity could itself be any kind of formal organization. So that takes us straight back to there. So
Mike.
It's a complex model, but that's the basic shape of it.
So you have a question, Mike. Hang on one second. Go ahead,
yes,
Carol.
You have two questions. I don't know whether you can see the questions.
Oh yes, yes I can. Sorry, I wasn't looking at that screen.
Don't worry.
Right. So first one from Tony Coates. We do care about levels of ownership. Some vendor feeds actually list all shareholders and their shareholdings where available. Ah, that's interesting. And this came up in yesterday's proof of concept calls. Should we release Tony's line and hear more about this? I think we should.
Tony?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I don't necessarily have a lot to add to that, but but we do certainly care, because there are many areas where we have to do due diligence on companies, and part of that is actually knowing what they do or don't own of other companies.
And do you do that by percentage, Tony?
I don't know. I don't know to what extent the exact percentage makes a difference, but it may matter in certain cases the size of the shareholding. But I mean, in some cases, it may just be whether they have it or not. That's probably the biggest single thing. But you know, you need to know to what extent something that they have shares in may benefit from, you know, some other thing that they're doing as a corporation, and whether that has to be flagged to regulators or anything like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that comes back to the broader question I had at the top here about types of relationship. And I think, yeah, let's have this conversation now, because what I'd then like to do is be able to come back next week with the full set of relationships, like you just saw with the reporting ones. You know, the stuff in there, it may not be complete. Let's work out which ones to look at. So we have, at the moment, we have voting shares by other companies.
It also applies to ownership in general. I mean, shareholding is one where it's sort of publicly known, but you know, any kind of control or ownership may matter.
Exactly, and this is where it gets very interesting, because you know, sometimes the data you receive may not have all that precision. Sometimes it may, but to define these things precisely, we've done the easy one, which is where you have ownership of voting shares, so you have ownership and control, because of course not all shares are voting shares, and we have where the owner is itself a company, because that's how you get parent and subsidiary. But what about where the owner is not a company, or a different kind of company, or you know, so not a limited company perhaps? What if the owner is a trust or something? And also where the shares are not voting shares. So what then? You know. And and then you have beneficial ownership. You might benefit from owning a stake in something, or you might or might not want to know about beneficial owner. We have that as a concept, and again, there's some uncertainty in the current model as to whether the label beneficial ownership explicitly talks about ownership regardless of control. So you've got control ownership over here, beneficial ownership over there, or whether certainly in some people's systems, beneficial owner is taken to refer to an owner with some control. And of course, then there are, as you know, many kinds of control which are not ownership. So we've got so any control that's not ownership based. You've got simple, you know, managerial control. You've got the ability to appoint board members, but does that only or always accrue only to shareholders, or are there other hidden types of control? And if so, should they also be represented? So, Tony, does that cover the sort of range of questions you were looking at there?
I think so. Yes. I mean, it's just as I said. You know, in some cases there are due diligence processes we have to go through where, you know, we need to know if there's a relationship between two companies or not. It's sort of an ownership thing. I mean, to be honest, we're also interested to know if there's a relationship between the same people on the boards. Because that, you know, that can be a matter of due diligence as well. So, you know, influence as well as ownership can be
influence.
important.
There's one we don't have. That's not quite the same as control. Yeah. So to Mike's point, and I think Con's point will fit right into this now as well, is that we need to know which. I can easily map out, and we almost have, for the most part, mapped out all the kinds of relationships that exist. The question is which ones are relevant, which ones matter to people and should be included, and that's something that.
Let's do some priorities, Mike. You can go down a rabbit hole with this. You know,
okay.
We're trying to get the basics done, so let's keep our eye on the ball.
Sure thing. Yep. So this is really setting out the agenda for next week. I'll just pick up Con's question very quickly. I think it's very similar anyway, and then we'll go back to the basic stuff. But this really has to set out the agenda for next week, which is what I wanted. So, Con Crowley, consideration of percentage of ownership reported as a regulatory obligation, as is done today, versus the potential to derive ownership at any point in time. Ooh. Con, can you expand on that?
Yes, I think it would boil down to what goes into your numerator and what goes into your denominator. What are the facts that you would need to collect? So if you're going to determine some percentage of ownership, you'll need to know what are the shares outstanding, or whatever the class of shares may be that you're identifying. So those all need to be identified. But then you've got the people who hold those shares and the total amount that they hold. So you'd be able to derive this, but how do you factor that, and should you factor that into the model that you're going through here?
Right. In terms of the should we, there's two points to make there. One I think is that from a point of view of any individual application and any data model for a particular use case, you might not want all of that stuff. But if there are meaningful concepts, we can define those meaningful concepts at the level of a common standard, even if only to point at one concept and say, we're not including that in this report or in this data model. But that comes back then to the second point, which is back to Mike's point. We'd like to hear from everybody on this call, perhaps by email or through the chat log or something, what are, out of all these possible kinds of relationships, and I think we've pretty much now articulated all the ones we currently have and a few others we don't, which of them matter, and then we can figure out, well, probably in the December draft we'll just stick to the basic share ownership based ones just so we have something simple and unambiguous, but then for the formal draft, the formal version in February, we can work out exactly which of all these to try and include.
I will just add that some of the work that's being done by the private sector preparatory group as part of the LEI work, they've been addressing this concept of building hierarchies and the data that's necessary to be able to do so. And this is getting somewhat into that territory, but they have identified probably a dozen or so types of ownership relationships, ownership and control relationships, including interlocking directorates and that type of thing. And I just wonder if some of that might be helpful to use here.
I think all of it would be helpful to use here. Again, if only to be able to say which of them one wouldn't include in a particular data model by having them all identified semantically. I think if they've identified...
So, Con, I haven't gone through the 420 unread emails on that, but if you could point to that document, I'd like to see it.
You're a slacker, Mike. I'll be happy to do that.
Fantastic. And if we get all that between now and next week, this will be... we can really look at all of these next week. I've shown you a little sample of just the reporting ones, and you see how complex it gets quite quickly, but at least we can see what's in there and have a look at the basic parameters by which all these things are defined. So I think that will put us in good shape. So, fantastic, thank you. Right, so then we'll dive into the simple stuff. So, firstly, I know we've been around this a couple of times already, but we looked at the ISO 17442 definition of legal entity, and I've actually now put the definition, I actually bought the spec and put the definition straight in here. I don't know if there are copyright implications to that, but that is the meaning of the term. But I've renamed the actual term, or I've proposed the renaming, which I want to discuss now. There are two terms whose names we keep changing and that are often synonymous in different things. One was what we've been calling liable entity. Before that, we called it legal person. We changed it to liable entity because it was more self-descriptive, but with a proviso that if legal person was a legally accepted and legally understood name that represented that exact concept, then we could change the label back. And I just wanted to make the point more generally that the labels here don't drive the meaning. So I know if you're in programming or anything like that, you generally start with choosing a nice label for something that defines the meaning, and then you define all the relationships around that. Here it's the other way around. We have a class of thing, we have all the relationships around it, and that's what defines its meaning, and then we try and pick the best label. So we're doing it, the label comes last. So I'm suggesting that as even when we put this to being liable entity, we said, well, if the legal folks say that legal person is right. Well, the legal folks, I had a good conversation with some of the lawyers from University College Cork a couple of weeks back, and again, if anybody can either again confirm or repudiate this, the concept legal person and in fact the label legal entity are both taken in legal circles to mean the same thing, and that is any entity which can incur legal obligation and be sued at law. So legal person is a well-defined label for that. Anybody, so I'm proposing to rename this back to what it was, legal person.
As long as legal entity is synonymous with it.
Right, and that's the other thing, yes, that the legal folks also said that legal entity in the legal world, the word legal entity is completely synonymous with legal person. So now we have an interesting challenge, which is this. There are two labels, legal entity in play in our world for two completely different meanings. One is the ISO 17442 definition of legal entity, which says the term legal entities includes but is not limited to unique parties that are legally or financially responsible for the performance of financial transactions or have the legal right in their jurisdiction to enter independently into legal contracts, regardless of whether they are incorporated or constituted in some other way, e.g. trust, partnership, contractual. It excludes natural persons, but includes government organisations and supranationals. So that is the term we've been working from all along. When we took the early draft we had of this model back in the summer, where legal person and legal entity were synonymous, and we said, but legal entity in ISO 7442 means this other thing. So we separated it out. We said it's a jurisdictionally defined, contextually defined thing. You recognise something as being contractually capable. We defined it as being some contractually capable entity, but we gave it the label legal entity. But the label legal entity is still, in the legal world, a synonym. Oh, see, I've got the synonyms back to front now because I keep changing it. It's still a synonym for legal person. So we cannot make that one label carry two meanings. My proposal is not to have the word legal entity anywhere other than as synonyms, and to have it as a synonym both of contractually capable entity and of legal person, because those two different meanings defined by these two definitions are both used in different contexts against the label legal entity, but they are different meanings.
Mike.
And so we've dealt with the separation of meanings, and now I'm proposing that we change the labels to lose legal entity altogether from the primary labels that we use. Yes, Carol?
On that point, Jacobus, I've released your line, a comment from Jacobus.
Mm-hmm.
Are you there? Can you be heard, Jacobus? No, he's put a note to say that so legal entity is basically the same as body corporate then.
Not quite, no. If we go back to our main hierarchy of things, body corporate is what we previously called an artificial legal person or an artificial person, and that label caused some confusion. A body corporate is something which is both a formal organisation and a legal person, so it excludes natural persons, which are of course legal persons. The scope, the identity scope of our contractually capable entity, the thing which fulfills the role of ISO legal entity, is any formal organisation, which includes a body corporate, a partnership, a trust, and so on. Does that make sense, Jacobus?
He hasn't got a microphone, but yes, it does. There we
yes,
are.
it does. Thank you. And there were two questions above that.
There are also. Can I?
Now?
Sorry, there is.
Yes.
There are questions above that, but also Julian Macri raised his hand in that last conversation. Julian.
Yeah, hi. I was actually the person I think who originally suggested calling it liable entity. I think we're probably likely to go around and around on this for a while. I'd like to ask the question though: who? To me, when I try to name things in a model, I want to try to avoid people in the future who look at the model. Because I think those of us who are on the phone, we've been in these conversations, we kind of understand what's going on. But, then when we hand this out to somebody else, right, who needs to use this, how can we name things to avoid confusion or misuse, right? That to me, I think, is the important thing, which gets to the question of who's really the target audience for this model. I mean, if it's lawyers, then obviously let's give it the legal terms, right? If it's technologists or some other target audience, I think we should ask the question, or at least understand who is the target audience and what kind of naming conventions would lead to hopefully the least misunderstandings by that target audience. That to me is the important criteria.
Right.
Maybe that might not be helpful either. I don't know, but
it is helpful. I think there's a couple of comments I think are worth making on that. So firstly, target audience. This is a business conceptual model, and like any conceptual model, it's intended to be a technology neutral, implementation neutral view of the subject matter.
Right.
Now, when you're doing one application, the scope of your conceptual model is fairly straightforward because you're defining the concepts you're going to use in that application. Here we have an additional challenge. As well as being a conceptual model, it is a standard and should cover the whole space rather than any particular application. Now, that's not directly relevant to your question, but it's just a bit of background, because that being the case, who is the audience for a conceptual model? Well, you're quite right. The people who you want to read a conceptual model are the implementers who you want to implement against it. But there's actually two audiences for a conceptual model, because the aim of having a conceptual model, and in particular the aim of presenting it to a business audience, is that you want to validate before any programmer cuts any line of code or creates any database scheme or does any development. You want to know that the conceptual model represents the business reality. Therefore, what we try to do is ground all of our terms in the business reality, not necessarily with any consideration for what labels will help a developer understand the requirement, but from the point of view of, is this correct and valid? Now, here it gets a bit theoretical, because in creating what is essentially an ontology, a formal representation of the business facts, it's grounded in basic logic, basic set theoretic logic, and that kind of makes it sometimes difficult to present to a business audience. But basically, what we do with any ontology is you think, well, where does the meaning come from? How the term's grounded, to give it a sort of artificial intelligence term? You know, what is the grounding of the concept? And for virtually everything we're interested in the securities domain, you know, so we started off with securities before we even came to business entities. Securities are all contracts. They have contractual terms which sets out rights and obligations and so on. So the grounding that we're most interested in is legal. We want to know that each of the concepts that we have is correct in law. And we've applied that same thinking to the types of entity that we deal with. And this is why we have this slight mismatch with the ISO version of legal entity, which is not grounded in law, and which is why it causes so much trouble. Because we want to at least be able to say, you know, what is the legal grounding? Now, it may be that in a particular application, you're not interested in that, and you're only interested in the fact of things being formal organizations. You don't care whether they're legally incorporated or not. But by articulating all the different kinds of entities that can exist, we can start to add facts that are unique to incorporated companies, facts that are unique to trusts, facts that are unique to partnerships, and so on, which we couldn't do if we didn't first dispose those terms in a hierarchy based on their legal or non-legal or formal form. And so that's why we've chosen to define everything in legal terms. And in so doing, I'm more comfortable using the legal labels that the legal people understand, because the legal people can then validate it and say, yes, that's right, or no, Mike, you've got it completely wrong. Because, of course, the whole point of presenting this is we're presenting it to the business audience to say, have we yet fully and adequately represented the facts about the world? Now,
Mike,
that does present a challenge for your developer audience, because they would then need to understand what are the terms they're seeing. But
right.
so that's the. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that before I go any further.
Yeah, no. Look. Like I said, I think no matter how we name these things, there's always going to be pluses and minuses. It's kind of probably depending on the audience. If we want to have use the legal naming as a common criteria, I don't think it's the end of the world, and as long as we're consistent with it, let's do that. Perhaps I do like the option I think that was shown, which might be, at least in some cases where we know there might be potential confusion, to maybe put an alternate name in parentheses that better describes a few of these boxes. Then you're meeting both objectives. You're meeting the objective of following the legal name convention, but at the same time trying to avoid misunderstandings in those places that I think we're going to obviously know there's going to be a few spots here that can be easily misinterpreted. If we kind of do that, then I think that probably meets all objectives. So, you know.
Fantastic. So I've got a couple more proposals for that before I move on. I've just added the synonym liable entity, which since that was the original label for this, I should already have done that. We also have the synonym legal entity, of course. I think in terms of any kind of grounding, whether it's legal grounding or not, it's far better to have some body of knowledge to be able to point at than no body of knowledge at all and trying to make something sink or swim on its own merits. We want this, you know, like in the academic world, we want as much referencing of things as possible. There is one third option, which Mike Atkins suggested last time, which may well meet with everybody's approval, which is to have a slightly longer name which has braces in it. So something like legal person brackets liable entity, or liable entity brackets legal person, or something like that. That makes for longer and more complex names. The synonyms do exist as synonyms for guidance purposes, but would that be something that people think would be useful or correct, or perhaps would just clutter the model, or what?
Well, Mike, it's still Lee here.
Yep.
I think if we intend this model to provide a lingua franca for the financial services and financial industry,
yep,
I think we're going to have to name things in a way that's kind of meaningful and acceptable to them, rather than meaningful and acceptable to lawyers. Notwithstanding your point about having a body of knowledge to fall back on, which I agree with, but that can be you fall back on, not the headline that you present in the model.
Ah. Okay.
You know, speaking personally, the senior bankers and the very senior people in RBS that I work with wouldn't have the faintest clue what you meant by liable entity, or even legal person for that matter. They would fully appreciate the legal entity.
Right. Yes, the problem with putting legal entity as the label for this concept here is that it completely differs from the ISO 17442 definition that the AI folks are going by. So we can't use legal entity as
Mike, I understand that, and I wasn't suggesting that, but the superclasses that binds the ISO definition of legal entity together with people is going to be the core entity in this model. That's the one that everybody in the bank's going to understand. Yeah, because those are the things that can be parties in contracts and instruments, and those are the things they deal with every day of their lives. They don't really care if they're people, companies, partnerships, trusts, government, whatever. To them, they're just flavors of this one core concept.
Right.
Whatever we want to call it.
Right. Well, that's, apart from individuals, that comes under formal organisation, and that is, you know, the thing that always fulfills the role of contractually capable entity, other than individual human beings, is formal organisation. So the thing that I would put where you have legal entity in a data model would be formal organisation, of which you then have underneath that body, corporate, trust, partnership, and so on.
Yeah, but can't we have a super that binds that organisation together with people?
Ah.
Because then you've got a thing that any party in any type of relationship.
Ah, yes, indeed.
Mike,
there are other possibilities. Yeah?
Yes.
There are quite a few responses as well, Mike, on this that are coming through.
Sure.
While you're typing away, just to interject, Mike Damas, who can't get on the phone from Thomson Reuters, he's saying that he agrees with remaining legal person. Legal entity obviously does cover the scope of legal person as it excludes individuals. This should be as all-encompassing as possible. And he follows up with, the label should then change in each instance based on the audience. We should be striving for a single label covering the most various synonyms, which is what you were saying. Using existing labels, which we have very specific limiting definitions, works against the goal. And then there are, following that, several...
Can you say the last bit again?
I'm sorry, I said it too quickly. Using existing labels, which have a very specific limiting definitions, works against the goal.
Indeed it does.
Okay. You've got several more on the questions that have been raised. Do you want to look at those whilst the conversation's going through?
Yeah, let me just have a look over at my other machine and see what I'm missing. So We didn't get back to Richie Barber's question earlier on yet. Is that one for now or for later?
Richie Barter was from a previous point. So the next one was Igor.
Oh, yeah, so we'll come back to that. Yes, Igor. Let us provide each entity with a definition and allow for multiple labels, each with a defined scope of applicability. Yes, that's a good idea. And when we get this into the adaptive user interface, we may be able to display different labels to different audiences, because all views are audience based. So it sounds like some of our different synonyms, maybe we need to, at the moment we just have the basic concept of synonym, but maybe if we have something where we can, we may need to add extra metadata for this, but be able to define for each synonym the audience that synonym is for, that would make a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, I think where we have a concept which exists only in law, it makes sense to have a legal label for it. Where we have concepts like formal organisation that are used in many different formats, different contexts, then yeah, it makes sense for that to show up as legal entity in one audience and contractually capable entity for another, and so on. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Do you want to expand on that, Igor? Does that make sense? Okay, and David Combe, on the topic of term usage, seems if there's an unreconcilable ambiguity as there is around legal entity, best to avoid the term. That's right, that's why I propose not to use it at all. Because if you use the term, half the audience will see the term and read into it their meaning rather than one you choose, and be confused rather than helped. Absolutely. Dave, do you want to add to that, or are you really just reinforcing what we're...
Dave is not connected to audio. That I can't release his line, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, thanks, Dave. That's absolutely where I was coming from, with having no concept labeled as legal entity. Leona O'Brien from UCC. Agree with my comments on the grounding of terms in law. Thank you, Leona. That was great. And it was Leona, by the way, that I and her colleagues that I had the conversation with that prompted this current discussion. So thank you. Did you want to add to any of that? Okay, and Robert Schmidt, if we ground this in law, does that mean we need a different model for each distinct legal system? No, provided that we're only covering the most basic concepts as universally applicable. Of course, there will be jurisdictional variations in these, but every jurisdiction has the concepts of the legal person. Every jurisdiction has the ability to create artificial legal persons, or what we call body corporate. Some of the kinds of entity below that, what we tried to do, and so far it seems to be working, is define what the DTCC folks called common buckets. You know, what are the, regardless of what they're called in Germany or France or somewhere, what are the kinds of forms an entity can take? And essentially, for the most part, you either register a new legal person by means of the issuance of equity in that, or by means of some kind of guarantee, or by various arrangements for making partnerships. And that's where it gets very jurisdiction dependent, the different kinds of legally incorporated partnerships. So we're sort of hoping, and so far we seem to have managed okay in defining the kinds of organizations that exist at the most general level. We took a look at a report from the World Bank that dealt with money laundering in the hopes of finding more complex ones. The only ones we found that are still giving us trouble is foundations, because I'm still not sure whether a foundation is a legal person or not a legal person, or whether a foundation in Panama is a legal person but a foundation in Luxembourg is not, and so on. But yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Did you want to expand on that, or come back to me on that?
I'm sorry, who is that? Who is that you want line released? Mike?
Robert Schmidt.
Sorry. No, unfortunately, he hasn't got any audio there. Robert, okay. If you put in your audio pin, if you're dialing in on the phone, your audio pin is 94. If you put that in, I can release your line. And while that's happening, Julian, you raised your hand again.
Yeah, just from my understanding, so we've decided we're not going to put the term legal entity specifically in here, right? Although we've
Correct.
put it in as synonyms in a few places.
That's right.
So, even though EDMC is kind of one of the big proponents, or specifying the whole legal entity identifier concept,
Yep.
where would that then show up if we have a model that doesn't actually explicitly throw a legal entity in the model?
Great question.
The concept is here. It's been relabeled contractually capable entity. It has the definition from ISO 17442. It has the term origin, ISO 17442 equals legal entity, definition origin, ISO 17442. So when you say, I mean, whether you can find it via a search is a different question to whether it's in the model. I think that may be what you meant.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just still
labels are not, I mean, this is why we've moved to semantics in the first place. Labels are never going to be a way to define meaning, and they're never going to be a way to find things, because every different business unit will always have different labels for the same things, and that's an incontrovertible fact of life. And that's why we have an ontology where we have one concept at a time with X number of synonyms, because right before we started this work, we had this realization that people will argue forever about the meaning of a word, but if you focus on what are the meaningful concepts that exist, people will agree on what the concept is, but will continue to disagree about the words, and that's fine. And other standards like FDVR also explicitly recognize that by distinguishing between the semantics of a concept versus the different speech communities that have different labels for that concept. So that's a very well established fact.
But you would say that legal entity identifier, that attribute, would live within contractually capable entity? I'm just asking the question.
No,
someone might wonder.
That's actually a very interesting question, and a very important one. I'll see if I can find the diagram we did this from. No, basically, the recognition that something needs an LEI, the recognition that something is capable of entering into or performing financial transactions, is a relative or contextually defined thing, because it's jurisdiction specific, and so we modeled it that way. It's in a different diagram, but we showed this has a relationship to a jurisdiction and so on. And the question then arose, well, should the identifier also relate to the relative thing, or should it go to the individual thing that is the identity of that thing? And I actually talked this over with Mark Flood from the OFR, and he felt very strongly that once you've recognized the need for something to have an LEI, the thing you give it to, it needs to be an independent fact about that thing in itself, so that from then on, you can always find that thing via that identifier in whatever context and in whatever jurisdiction. So recognizing the need for an LEI goes here on contractually capable entity, but the LEI itself is a property of the formal organization. And that was, you're thinking we could have gone it one of those two ways, and that was the strong views I got there. I've not heard any strong views to the contrary, but it seems that the LEI, in fact, if I go to that, that's one of the things I wanted to look at today, was these basic facts about things, names, addresses, and identifiers. So if we look at this term here, we have formal organization, we have body corporate, we have legal person. You'll see that a formal organization can have some kind of organizational identity code. One such code is the LEI, or legal entity identifier, that also identifies and only identifies formal organizations. So once you've recognized in some jurisdiction that something should have an LEI, it's given to that organization as a fact about that organization. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
Okay, I mean, if that answers the question, and I guess if I had the power to start things over, I guess then I would call these things formal organization identifiers rather than legal entities.
Absolutely, yes, that would have helped, wouldn't it? If the semantics had been thought of at the beginning of this exercise, would it not have helped an awful lot of going around in circles?
Yeah, I'll get to really understanding. And as long as LEI in the future never gets assigned to a true natural person,
right?
Because that's the distinction we're making here, right? Is that
right.
These are truly organizations and not, people, wealthy
Correct.
people with a lot of investments, and they're treated as real people rather than
Exactly. So there are entities, there are people that can enter into contractual relationships, but they do not get an LEI.
And that'll never happen in the future.
It should never happen if this model is taken as a guideline.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah, you can see where I'm going. I'm trying to make sure.
Yeah.
These things have to make sense to people, especially people who aren't on this phone call.
Exactly.
At the end of the day.
And that's the thing, is that when we get into this level of detail, it becomes quite complex. And people who haven't seen it look at it, it seems too complex. We looked at the draft we had over the summer, which had legal entity and legal person as the same thing, and we said, oh, this is too complex. Now become more complex. But hopefully, and this is where I think being able to show different labels to different audiences will help. But ultimately, you need narrative. I mean, the meanings of things are defined by the facts about them, not by the labels. We then choose the labels after the event to try and make them as useful as possible. But it is.
Sorry, Mike. Lee here. So, did you conclude on what exactly the superclass was that binds legal entities and people together?
We did not.
Because when we get into talking about the roles that things play in processes, then what we'll find is that both people and legal entities, to use our definition, can play exactly the same roles in almost every single type of process.
Right. Very good point. So this is something I've been wondering about for a while. So, at the very top, we have autonomous entities. We have human beings, which may or may not be of legal age, of course, or legal capacity. So a natural person is a human being that's also a legal person. Some of the roles we've defined for legal person and some of them for formal organisation, I agree we need a super type. Should it be a logical union, or should we insert something into the hierarchy that basically becomes a parent of those two, but not a parent of organisation, which is not necessarily...
Well, why isn't it a parent of organisation as well? Because they can play the same role.
So any organisation at all, that includes...
foundation.
Well, a foundation is a kind of formal organisation. A trust is a kind of formal organisation. We define a formal organisation as any organisation that has some contract among the principals to setting out their various liabilities and ownership rights and so on. The question is, the kind of relationships you're seeing, can that also apply to, a tennis club, a political party, a non-formal, a cartel, a
cartel,
social group? Right, but they exist. It's a meaning.
Well, a political party, for example. Political parties certainly buy and sell a lot of things.
Right. So those would be a formal organisation. But yes, we've distinguished between formal and informal, and this may be a bit simplistic. We've distinguished formal organisation by virtue of having, I'll just show you it on this diagram, some formal agreement among the principals. What the hell is it called? Let me just find it.
Yeah, and your local Scouts group can have a bank account.
Yes, right, and that may not necessarily have an organisation covering agreement.
No.
Yeah. Okay, so I sort of assumed, and this is something I wanted to come to actually, that the sorts of things we're interested in will always have some formal standing, some covering agreement. And in fact, the reason when we included that we got formal and informal organisations, we recognised that this would actually be quite useful, at least defining and naming the idea of something that, as you say, should not be owning shares or should not be doing something or other. So we have informal organisation as the mutually exclusive set with formal organisation, and formal organisation has some covering agreement. But actually, to open a bank account, do you even need that? I don't think you do. I actually opened a bank account once for a branch of a political party, and we didn't need that. So in fact, we need something that can have a bank account versus something that can't, like a school of fish or something.
Well, a bank account is a form of contract. A bank account is just a form of contract.
Yes. So should we say that under formal organisation we're interested in anything that can have a bank account rather than anything that has some formal contractual standing?
I wasn't suggesting that. That was just an example.
Yeah, but I'm suggesting it because that may be what's important from the point of view of being able to enter into various kinds of contractual relationship, because it's clear that you don't have to be a legal person to enter into a relationship. You only have to be a legal person to be sued for things that go wrong afterwards, which is why we have that as a separate concept. But we've assumed so far that everything else that entered into a formal organisation apart from human beings was a formal organisation. So that actually, you're right, it would be the union of formal organisation and legal person that would be contractually capable. Yeah, so if we have a common class that sits between autonomous entity and all of these, then what would you call it?
Ooh. Well, I know what we call it, but you won't like it.
Go on.
We call it party.
Right. Yes, understood. And a lot of models call it party, and you're right, I don't like it because in English and in our model, a party is something which is party to something, and guarantor, issuer, customer, counterparty are all defined as kinds of parties, as something in that context rather than something in and of itself.
They're all party roles, absolutely. But we define a party as anything that can play a party role.
So a potential party.
Mike, an actor would be a good name, maybe. Actors play roles.
Yes. Again, we use actor for something that actually is acting in a role rather than something that could act in a role. So the same question applies to a party, for example, down there.
That makes it more understandable. You can explain it better, the model, if you say an actor has a role. That's.
Dave McComb has also added. He said he sort of hates the term, but they borrowed social being.
Ooh.
From SIG.
Yes. Right. So this comes back to this actually may well fit into some of the stuff I'm still reading through from John Searle on the construction of social realities, which is where most of these kinds of entity are in fact social constructs. Yes, let's think about it. Let's have a few more comments before we try and nail this down, but we'll put it in anyway with its two possible names for now. And it could be either a legal person or a formal organisation.
Also, Mike from Mike Damas, who's sending emails on this, if you consider a cartel as being under a formal organisation, does a cartel have a legal capability to have a bank account?
Well, this is why I said that cartels would very explicitly be an example of what comes under informal organisation.
Absolutely.
So no. Do you want to come back on that?
Cartels, you need to report them straight away.
Right, you do. What do you report them as? Formal organisations that you don't approve of, or informal organisations that you do?
They're clearly informal and illegal organisations.
Right. So it is an informal organisation. It's a kind of informal organisation. I'm very tempted to add it to the model just so that we can see it. Maybe,
yeah, that's a good idea.
Definition for that? There it is. It's a kind of informal organisation, and we can put further facts around it that it's not legal.
it's a covert organisation.
Now, are all kinds of informal, illegal organisation able to be called cartel? Organised crime syndicates, I suppose, are not necessarily the same thing as a cartel. How far down did it go?
All favours of illegal organisation.
So does this term cover all types of illegal informal organisation, or just the ones that do business?
Well, Mike, on our RBS model, we have the equivalent of informal organisation subtyped down into illicit informal organisation and legitimate informal organisation. And illicit includes cartels, crime syndicates, etc. And legitimate includes things like clubs and, you know.
So if you have that level of detail.
Illegal?
Sorry?
Is OPEC illegal?
You can have a legal cartel. Good point.
Well, yeah, we don't classify OPEC as a cartel.
Might be safer to label it illicit cartel.
even if you think it acts as one, it's a legitimate organisation.
So I'm going to relabel this.
OPEC is a cartel, right?
Yeah. A cartel is anything that fixes prices. Some things that fix prices do so illegally. Some things that fix prices, we let them get away with it. So, yes, I think.
Well, it doesn't only fix prices. It also does output for oil production, allocation of territories. I mean,
yeah, it does all sorts of stuff.
So I'm going to call the ones that are not OPEC illicit cartel, just for the sake of clarity. It doesn't really change the reading. So I'm going to add the rest of the ones in those notes offline from this session. But knowing that you have this in a database somewhere tells me that this is worth having and not too much detail.
We have OPEC as a trade association, and if that's any help.
A trade association, did you say?
Yeah, a bit like ABTA.
ABTA?
Well, you know, Association of Travel Agents.
Oh, ABTA, yes, of course.
Clearly a price-fixing scandal. Syndicating.
Loads around. Yep, comes with the difference between whether your price fixing is or isn't improved by the government of the day. And there's a very large rabbit hole to not go down there. But I think I'll add, not right now, but the ones that you just read to me from the RBS model, I'll add a few examples of each of those so we can see, this will be in the organization model, all of these kinds of organizations. And that's actually extremely helpful in also clarifying the semantics of things. Sometimes you may not need all these terms in a database, but when you're looking to understand what's meant by the term, looking at what's coming off it might well be helpful in pinning down its meaning. So I think there's a dual function there for having these kinds of things in there.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so the questions queue has gone wild while I wasn't looking at it. Where did we get to? What did we miss?
You've missed Leona definitely at the end, the last one.
Right. Okay. Leona, do you want to pick up the mic?
Leona, your line is released. I don't know whether you have audio. No, she's on voice over IP, so maybe not.
She has a very good point. Having a bank account certainly can't be a unique and defining fact about formal organisation, because of course it's also true of individuals, and of course sole traders may open separate bank accounts for their shop or something like that. So that's a good catch. We're going to think if we try to regularise language, Robert Schmidt, quite right. We can't. That's why we do ontology first, worry about the language later. cartel, the owner again, cartel is a collection of companies that come together to manipulate the market in some way, i.e. price fixing. There's a nice definition there. I'm just going to pop that in. A collection of companies that come together to manipulate the market in some way, e.g. price fixing. Thank you. And are therefore formal organizations. Ooh.
What?
Mike, I think you need to read the question sometimes, because I don't know that not everybody will see those.
Right. So the question was, a cartel is a collection of companies that come together to manipulate the market in some way, i.e. price fixing. Importantly, they would be registered companies and therefore formal organizations. Right, so I missed a bit there. Well, the individual organizations would be formal organizations, yes, but the members of the organization that is the cartel would presumably not be.
Absolutely. Better be in prison.
But the cartel is not. And that sounded like a very strong absolutely on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And in fact, that means that where we have organization has member, when we get down to cartel, we can refine that into, where's my have member? Here we are. Cartel member is formal organization. Yes. And that captures that. This is cartel. And that becomes a refinement of the organization has member relationship. Yes, there are various approaches to labeling on these object properties, which we'll come back to. So there we have it. That is one of those. Bingo. Good. So where are we? Quick sanity check. It's 10 minutes after 10. Didn't agree a label on this common class. I did earlier have logical unions for some of these kinds of things, and elsewhere in the model where we have different parties, we often point to logical unions, but this area has changed so much. Potential party or social being, this would be almost anything except an animal or a robot, of course, or an informal organisation. So it's either a common parent of, or common union, or logical union of legal person or formal organisation, or even a natural person or formal organisation, which is what originally is suggested. I just bypassed that slightly. I know what we mean, but what would we call it? I see my party is, it's just a party to me is being party to something. It's being the party rather than being potentially a party, hence potential party. Social being is good.
Yeah, we used to call it potential party.
Oh, really? Oh, I thought I just made that up. Okay.
No, because we dropped the potential because it was just a bit. In the end, it was too clumsy.
Sure.
Everybody knew that parties may have been historic, may be current, or maybe in the future.
Yes, or maybe party to several different relationships in different contexts, of course.
Absolutely.
Yep. So I'm going to go with potential party then, if anybody else does. I think the fact that it's self-defining, and even though I thought we just made it up, it was already out there. I like it. I know it's clunky, but we do have more concepts to go around than you'd ever need in any one application. Your application would probably use the word party if you want to keep it simple, but I'm good with potential party.
I think you'll find that very useful when it comes to doing the association.
And in fact, this is then where we can link party to at the top. The thing that can be a party and then we refine that to those things that must be legal persons. So if you're a party to a loan, you better be a liable entity, otherwise where does the liability go? I may be wrong, but that's like I guess if you're party to a security transaction and so on, there are restrictions to what kinds of thing can be party in different contexts, but the most general to be a party, and I'll relink the party model itself to potential parties so that all our party hierarchies link directly across to this nice dual hierarchy of formal organisation and legal person. Go on, somebody have a comment? Okay. Good. Well, it was very helpful. Where did we get to?
I'm sorry, did you actually answer? I'm sorry, Mike. Did you actually answer? And I've lost track of this. Richie Barter's question from right at the beginning of the session.
Ah, right. Oh, and Tony Coates had a question that is left as well now on ontology approach. Right, Richie Barter. No, I did not. Now's a good time to get back to it. Sorry, Richie. From my experience, the underpinning concept from a bank's perspective is primarily defined around exposure upon default of an entity or counterparty and how best to aggregate and monitor exposures linked to that counterparty over time. Also key is to understand and monitor changes in the given company's structure over time, this being less from a reporting and more from a risk management or trading perspective. So this is back to the relationships agenda, what relationships we want to keep in the model and have for next week. But Richard, do you want to expand on that, or shall I simply? Well, please do expand on it anyway.
Hi, Mike. Yeah, it's just from my experience in the front office as a structurer and a trader that these concepts or this kind of model would prove very useful to us in the event that we're trying to aggregate exposures across multiple trading systems for risk reporting. The key would be, for example, where you would have potentially a large corporate that's based around the world, where you may have one entity within that corporate structure where you have derivative exposures and then potentially loan or other exposures at other levels in that company hierarchy. You need to understand control functions. That's important, but also kind of in default, which is kind of really our key and ultimate exposure point. And you know, how does that relationship exist? How does it change? I guess that's the key really. The tricky bit being when you have potentially two parts of a large financial institution, one who are writing the loans and the other who are writing derivatives, when you're necessarily not aggregating those exposures but monitoring them from across two different systems, how you define those names and how you monitor them is a challenge. So it seems that the model takes account of that. It seems robust, but I'm just thinking of a use case where I had this model to apply it in a CVA or risk management perspective. If I'd be able to do that, so that was just an observation. Yeah, another interesting point.
That was an answer to my question about what was of interest. Yes. So I just quickly get to your other point. So this really comes back to why you're interested in the relationships, which should help us to navigate back to what relationships we're interested in. And in fact, that includes position relationships, contractual relationships, as well as company internal structure. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, one obvious example that from my experience is that you may have a corporate who's issuing debt from one particular area in their hierarchy, but they would be getting hedging against that particular exposure, so they may issue a floating rate security from one area of that corporation, and then they may hedge that with a derivative contract directly into a financial institution at another area level in their company hierarchy, and it's just reconciling those two exposures to the extent you retain exposure to the securities that have been issued as well, and that could be a challenge.
Right. So yes, so you have different companies in the group.
Correct.
Is the relationship, what you call in the company hierarchy, exclusively and only the holding of voting shares of one company in another, or is there also other forms of control that would be needed to be taken into account in this same context. I think you just
well, let me give you a brilliant real-world example of that. Yeah, Virgin Group, from a risk management perspective, anybody that deals with any member company of the Virgin Group would consider that all of those companies be lumped together under a non-existent entity called the Virgin Group. Yeah, even though there is actually no legal relationship in existence between those entities.
But that's tricky. That's tricky because as a trader, I can't hedge against that particular position. I can't aggregate that in my books correctly. So if I want to go ahead and execute CDS to hedge it myself against a nominal Virgin exposure, there may be just one entity under which the debt is issued, which the CDS is underwritten on, and that entity may then differ from that which I face on the derivative exposure itself. So you actually have, in default, real separate entities, some which are guarantored, guarantees between them, and others which are just separate entities.
No, I understand and I agree, but from a point of view of setting counterparty dealing limits and credit limits, yeah, and doing internal credit ratings and things like that, certainly what we do at RBS is we have to have this synthetic thing called the Virgin Group in order to manage that.
Yeah, okay. It's a slightly different approach to my experience, but that's potentially obviously
yeah,
one way to do it.
Each thing.
But it's trying to get to the same. It's trying to deal with the same problem of companies who use separate legal entities within their group structure to do various financial activities with different banks and different groups within banks and across banking institutions,
yes,
and how you aggregate that risk. And that's a very real front office ongoing issue, especially when you go across countries and jurisdictions.
And a regulatory issue as well.
Yes, it actually sounds quite similar to our earlier mysterious thing from the FSA about reporting based on a brand name, because Virgin, correct me if I'm wrong, is a brand name. Outside of your own internal systems, the only thing that holds all that together is the very strong brand called Virgin.
Yep.
But other than the brand, there's nothing that holds it together.
It may suit from a reporting perspective for regulators to add all of those numbers up for a given nominal counterparty, but from a trading perspective, I really care about what happens when someone falls over and who falls over, what kind of decision making a corporation can make within its corporate structure to begin to shut down arms of itself in the event things start going wrong. So could ABC Corporate shut down its UK arm where I have all my derivatives exposures just because it suits it in a certain case? And that's where it gets really nitty gritty, because they've designed the corporate structures so that they can shut areas of them down to defend the overall group in the event that things start going wrong.
And that answers my next question. The ability to shut down something seems to me to mean control of any form.
No, sorry, shutdown is the wrong term. How I would clarify it is there's ownership, where these individual entities within the corporate group structure will stand on their own. They may pass profits up the corporate structure. It would require a direct injection of additional cash to save that branch or that individual additional corporate, should the group decide to do it as a corporation.
And that would be share ownership based?
It's not. They would own the underlying element, and they would then choose whether they need to add additional cash to the extent they got into trouble, which is always a risk for us as hedgers, because we look at it and say, okay, so in a time of stress, will additional cash be made available? There's no explicit guarantee. There's just ownership. How do I manage that? Do I assume none? Do I assume some amount? And how would that work?
And that's ownership with or without control at that point, isn't it? It's simply that you hold shares in that thing, and you might choose to inject more capital into the thing that you hold shares in order to save it, regardless of whether you have voting shares or not. Or you may choose not to inject capital in and let it fold.
Well, this is outside of the context of joint ventures or multiple ownership structures. Typically, it's all within the same group. So you would have the board of directors at the holding company level looking down the structure, or whoever it is ultimately decides, and saying, right, there's a problem here. Do we need to push more cash in or not? Legally, we don't have to. It's up to us to choose. Obviously, there's the less defined and more, how to describe it, the knock-on effects of doing that with your banking counterparties in other aspects of your financial transactions, should you choose to do that. But that's always a decision that can be made by the corporation.
Right. So then implicit in everything you're saying here is that group structure is based on the holding of shares in one company by another company.
Correct.
The legal group structure is. The effective control structure isn't based on equity ownership solely. Yeah.
That's what I was trying to get to. So holding the
You know, if anybody believes for a moment that Richard Branson doesn't exert executive control over every single Virgin company, then they're wrong.
Right, and that's why I wanted to see whether to also include control relationships that exist independently of ownership, things like management control, other forms of control, I don't know, maybe just effective control.
Yeah, even though there's no holding company that binds them together, they still effectively operate as a group. Keyword being effectively.
But I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it's a fair point. I think, though, in default, would you go after to claim back assets against the corporate element or the group itself? Or
no, I agree with you. In default, you have to go with the legal situation. There's no choice.
Right.
Because the CDSs and everything are written up against the legal entities, yeah? Correct. Your references are those specific legal entities. There is no group.
You have to, right, and in that situation, you're looking at the legal ownership of controlling shares of one thing in another. Right.
Yeah, so if Virgin Aviation, for example, went bust, yeah, that doesn't legally affect any other parts of the group. It might financially, but it doesn't legally.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
And this is down to risk management, to default, is what may happen when there's like a virtual group or a kind of an overall non-legal form of control that you anticipate in your risk management by saying this entity will or won't allow that entity to fold under the following circumstances.
That's a judgment call.
Yes.
Right. Good. So that means that when we look at the relationships next week, we will look at these other forms of control as well. The existing control mechanism model very messy because we tried to deal with very much these kinds of nuances, and it got very untidy very quickly. But I'll try and keep it clean. Now that we have a slightly cleaner hierarchy of actual kinds of entity, it may be a lot simpler than last time we looked at it. But good, thank you. So that really sets out our agenda for the relationships conversation next time. We've got 5 minutes, 6 minutes until we finish. So we've dived into the naming side of things. We've picked up some actions to complete on organization types. We didn't look at the other things. So we've got 3 sets of common terms I wanted to look at this week and just really nod at and say, is this okay or not? So I had a diagram which was fairly complex of common terms, and I split it into 3. One was the identification and classification. We haven't looked at classification yet. The other is the names. So, you know, entities have names, and human beings have personal names, and of course, any legal person has a legal name. You may have more than one legal name, incidentally, if you're in a multilingual jurisdiction. So both in Canada and in Belgium, for example, I think they have a French name and a Dutch name, or a French name and a English name, or something like that. Hence the one or more that we've got sitting there. Brand name, we talked about briefly earlier on in terms of reporting, perhaps even also in terms of the risk scenario we were just looking at. So somebody asked from a modeling point of view the question, did we need this hierarchy of things as names, or couldn't they just all be text? And I would say that for most applications, there will probably be text. But from the point of view of defining concepts, I've disposed them in a hierarchy, and that does allow you, where it's relevant, to have applications that reason over or talk about brand names in various contexts, legal names, and so on. So that's why we have those. And we've got, under name itself, what relationships there are to name. Well, every autonomous entity can be called something, it can be formally known as something. This is all going back to autonomous entity itself. I'll now need to add these things in for that new term we put in the middle here. So I guess where these relationships go will need to change. But I would suggest that anything that can act on its own part, this includes animals and self-actualizing robots as well, just to complete the whole scope of it, although we're not obviously going to model those, would have a name. Formerly known as, then if it's a formal organization, it may or may not have a trading name, so trading as, and that includes, of course, if you're a legally incorporated formal organization, a body corporate, then as well as your legal name, you would, of course, also inherit that fact that you have a trading name, trading as. You may have an alias as well. I can't remember when we got that in, but that was what we put in there at some point, where any name it's known by but not its usual given name or its registered formal name. That's to meet anti-money laundering requirements. We add that in one of our reviews. Are there any other kinds of name or relationships to name that are of interest? Or does this pretty much cover what we want in this current release? So we've got a nice clean model. And I'll just, as I say, replicate most of these for the new class we just put in of potential party. Good, that was the easy bit. Addresses are a lot more complex. We've gone around a few different approaches to this. In the proof of concept, we've looked at how to define an address as something that has a beginning and end date and therefore has facts about it as the address of something at a given time, very similar to our relative entity concept. For simplicity for this version, while we're still working through that, and for simplicity of review, I've actually thought, well, let's just talk about an address as a kind of thing. I've got a whole bunch of stuff behind that, which we can look at next time. And we have, formal organization has an address, it has a primary address, it might be called the headquarters address or something, it has operating addresses, and a body corporate is registered at some address. We did in the earlier version try and tease out some of the distinctions between what can or can't be in a registered address, because that is actually very different by its nature. It's the address at which the entity is formally registered. It's also the address at which papers can be served on that entity for the purpose of legal process. In most jurisdictions, it therefore excludes things like post boxes. It turns out in some, such as South Africa, it actually can include a post box, and therefore there's really nothing to immediately distinguish from a postal address. But I'm still at this idea of, you know, subclassing this to the registered address and being able to, perhaps outside of the ontology, but in terms of business rules, be able to say, maybe on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, what can or can't be in that address.
Well, hang on, Mike,
yeah.
It's Phil here. There's a crucial distinction between a post office box address and any other type of postal address, namely that a post office box address refers to a box, a physical box within a mail handling organization that's got nothing, physical location which has got nothing at all to do with the user of that post box. Whereas all the other types of refer to physical locations that do have some direct relevance to the user.
That's right, yes. And that's why I was a little bit surprised to find that even in South Africa, where I know many people only have postal addresses, but you can't serve papers on a postal address. So I'd like to validate whether that assertion was right about being able to use a non-PO box address.
I think that is right. I've read that as
well. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because what happens if you don't collect your mail?
Well,
you then not have the papers served on you.
Technically, it means you haven't served the papers as we would understand that term, because they have to be physical. Then, but I guess that's their jurisdiction, so that's fine. It's down to them.
Yeah. But in any other, it's not allowable. And this is where we're out of time now. But just to show you, and I'll put this up on the on the website as soon as I get a chance. But we've actually done some fairly complex stuff in address itself, which is that an address is an index to a location. It could be network address, physical address, any kind of place, be it physical or virtual. An index to it is an address. A postal address we've redefined completely as being a set of individual address fragments, i.e. textual things, street addresses, building subunits, non-specific fragments, and I'm thinking we could actually replace all of these with the vCard address fragments. Each fragment defines some physical address elements, such as a building subunit, a building, a street, or indeed a PO box, which I haven't put in here yet. And so that's the pattern. We're over time now, but that's the pattern that I'm proposing allows you for some applications to talk about physical addresses, physical postcode areas for risk management and so on. For other applications to just basically take this bag of textual fragments and say that's the address. And it may be that we want to distinguish between those two, the physical versus the textual, in distinguishing between trading addresses and registered addresses. I haven't figured out how, but that's the framework within which to think about that. So a lot of thought for that for another time. I see Richie's got some more thoughts on SPVs and trusts, which is great because I'm going to try and wrap up that work as soon as I can as well. It's not completely wrapped up yet, but I look forward to that, Richie. Thank you very much. So we're out of time, 2 minutes over. Thank you all very much for your patience. Sorry to those I didn't get to. Any last minute comments or questions before we wrap up the session?
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you all very much. It's been a fascinating and wonderful session as ever. Thank you very much for your participation. I'll get the notes turned round as quickly as I can, and we'll speak again next week. So, goodbye everyone. And all your comments will be on the will be included in the notes and included in the observations log as well. So those will all be in the notes.